Cool. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start. Thank you for coming to my session about documentation initiatives related to both Starshot and things that are going on in Drupal.org. We've got a pretty small audience, so we'll keep it casual. And if you've got questions as I'm going, feel free to let me know. And we'll make sure this gets recorded as well. My name is Joe Schindler. Oh boy. Is that? There we go. My name's Joe. I work at DrupalIze.me, where we produce Drupal training material, both written and video. And you can find me as EOJ the Brave on Drupal.org or Slack or pretty much anything where people hang out on the internet. In my role at DrupalIze.me, where I produce a lot of training content, that really kind of dovetails nicely with allowing me the opportunity to work on documentation-related things in the community. So I get a bunch of my time, I guess, sponsored or donated by DrupalIze.me to be able to work on documentation, and I'm thankful for that. I've been working on and talking about Drupal documentation related stuff for quite a while. As I was preparing for this presentation, I looked back at times that I've talked about documentation in the past, and I was like, yeah, recently I was complaining about this thing, and I was like, oh, that was actually 2015. So I've been talking about this for quite a while, and I have lots of feelings about it. I want to start by sort of setting the stage for this presentation and providing a little bit of context. I believe that Drupal's documentation is the work of a large number of volunteers who come together to create all of the content that we find on Drupal.org and api.drupal.org. But not only those places, and the kind of broader internet where we find people volunteering their time to help with Drupal learning materials on their company blog or their personal website or answering questions on Reddit. All of this together, I think, I consider to be parts of Drupal's documentation. And I want to give a shout out to everyone who makes Drupal's documentation. It is truly a community effort. I'm currently listed as the maintainer for the top level documentation page on Drupal.org. And one of the side effects is that anytime somebody makes an edit to any sub-page of a guide that you are the maintainer of, Drupal.org sends you an email. So in my case, I get an email for pretty much every edit to the documentation on Drupal.org. And frankly, I mostly ignore them. The nice thing for me, though, is it gives a little not oversight, but it gives me a little bit of an overview of who's contributing to documentation and how much and when. And I think one of the things, the trend that I've noticed is that there are a couple of people in the community who contribute to documentation a lot. And I'm very thankful for all the work that they do, so thank you for that. There are also a lot of people who contribute to the documentation a handful of times here and there. And it's the efforts of both of these groups that come together to create the documentation that we have. But mostly I wanted to acknowledge that the documentation is created by a lot of really cool people doing a lot of really good work. In particular, because I'm going to gripe a bit about the documentation and things that aren't working well. And I just want to make sure that this isn't a reflection of the people who are doing the work, but in my opinion is a reflection of the system in which we're working on the documentation and changes that need to be made to that in order to better support the people who are doing the work. So my thesis is that Drupal's documentation has a perception problem and we need to change that. That's the overall goal is changing the perception of Drupal's documentation. I think whenever people are asked about what Drupal needs to improve, documentation is one of the things that is frequently cited near or at the top of the list. And this isn't really anything new. It's something we've known as a community for a long time. Whenever there are surveys, or if you go back and look at Dries's sort of state of Drupal presentations from previous DrupalCons, documentation is often cited as a thing that needs improvement. And I think this is important because changing this perception so that people don't see Drupal's documentation and think, oh, Drupal sucks, they have a positive first experience because first impressions really matter. I mentioned this already, but I gave a talk back in 2015 about Drupal's documentation. And in that talk, I proposed some changes that we should make in order to update Drupal.org's infrastructure to allow better editorial control of documentation, to give people some oversight and the opportunity to review content that's edited, to hopefully just help keep things of a higher and more consistent quality. I also proposed at that time a community initiative to create a Drupal 8 user guide, and both of those things have been done. A bunch of changes have been made to Drupal.org's infrastructure over the years to allow for guides and guide maintainers. We, as a community, authored the Drupal 8 user manual, which turned out really great and has been updated for every major version of Drupal since then. And my thinking at that time, I think, was, if we want people to read Drupal's documentation, all we need to do is just write a better manual or a better documentation and point them at it. And we made a lot of progress towards that, but I think it kind of missed the big picture, which is you can't just make a couple of pages of really good documentation and publish them on Drupal.org and expect people to have a positive first experience. Because the reality is, for a lot of people, their first experience with Drupal's documentation is when they land on a README file for a contrib module that they just installed, and either the file just doesn't exist at all, or it's unable to answer their question. And regardless of the fact that maybe they're one of just a couple hundred people that need that documentation, if that's their first impression, they go away with a negative perception of Drupal's documentation. And so we need to think about this not just infrastructure for one particular set of pages, but as a system, as a whole, how do we make it, I guess, more impressive? And I think this problem has proven to be really sticky. My thinking is kind of we can create as much new infrastructure as we want. We can put as many systems into place as we want to, but if they don't sort of address the big picture of making sure that we are improving not only the core documentation, not as in Drupal core, but kind of the main silos of documentation, but also all the little fringe pieces that people run into, we're gonna have a hard time changing this perception. Basically, I don't think we can just write a better manual and expect people to change their ideas about Drupal documentation. There's more work that needs to be done. And so that's what I want to talk about. I already sort of laid out my feelings about what I think people's current perceptions are of Drupal's documentation. I recognize that that's a very sort of broad overview. I think there are parts of Drupal's documentation that are excellent, and I think there are parts that need improvement. But I want to talk a little bit about the ongoing work with the Drupal CMS and documentation efforts related to that. I'll talk a little bit about updates for Drupal.org and kind of just the broader ecosystem of how and where we write documentation. And then I've got a couple of ideas that I'd like to share for how I think we can improve some of these things moving forward. And then hopefully we'll have time to hear other people's ideas as well. So let's focus on Drupal CMS first and the documentation efforts there. In part because this is what I've been most involved with and spending time on recently, so I have more thoughts about this currently. I would say if I could summarize the current state of documentation for Drupal CMS is that it's going through its growing pains phase. Prior to the release of Drupal CMS 1.0, we did a bunch of work to try to author documentation for Drupal CMS, and it happened kind of really fast and a little bit ad hoc. Now we're dealing with this scenario where sometimes when you go fast, things break, and we've kind of left behind us a trail of unanswered questions and technical debt that we need to address if we want the documentation to be sustainable. So we've made good progress, but now we're in the phase of kind of trying to a little bit clean up the mess that we made in the process of getting there and figuring out how to go forward in a more sustainable way. The documentation current for Drupal CMS is currently primarily worked on by the documentation track team, which consists of myself, Lenny from the Drupal Association, who is the track lead, and my friend and coworker Amber, who works with me at Drupalize Me and has helped to author the documentation. This part of the arrangement here is that Amber and I are sponsored to work Drupalize Me, and thus Amber and I, are sponsored to help work on creating documentation for Drupal CMS. And Lenny helps lead up that effort. Our goal with the Drupal CMS documentation, the stated goal is to create best-in-class documentation for Drupal CMS. My interpretation of this is that we want to write documentation so that when people are evaluating Drupal CMS against other competitors in the space, they look at our documentation and they're not immediately turned away, and maybe they compare our documentation favorably to that of our competitors and say, this is as good, or maybe even better than what I'm finding elsewhere. And I will be the first to admit this is going to be a very steep hill for us to climb. But I guess that's why we call it a Starshot, trying to make the impossible possible. We've made some good progress so far. We have, at this point, written and published on Drupal.org about 25 pages of content. A few more just got published. This content is authored by Amber and I, reviewed by subject matter experts. It's been copy edited. It's been had a sort of style guide or voice and tone applied to it. And it's all published on Drupal.org using the new Drupal.org design system. And most of this was published when Drupal CMS 1.0 came out. We're continuing to publish additional content as we're able to. I mentioned this already, but we wrote a style guide. I guess, well, maybe 25 pages might not seem like a whole lot of content given the amount of time that we've spent on it. There's also a lot of work that went into developing tools and guidelines that we could apply when we're writing this content. Things like creating a style guide so we would know what the documentation should sound like and what it should look like, aiming for consistency across all of it. Defining who our target audience was so that we were writing that every page is written to the same person. And this work happens in the background. It's not something that is published directly on Drupal.org currently, though I do think long-term it should be. But all of this is done in order to help us just be more consistent with the documentation. I would think of it as like, the goal is, even though it is not written by a single person, if you are reading the documentation, it should sound as if it was all written by the same person. We've also put a bunch of effort into creating an outline, or really a sort of draft outline for what we think this documentation should contain, rather than just sort of start throwing words at the page and hoping we wrote the right things. We thought it was important to step back and sort of try to define an initial outline of what we thought a great Drupal CMS guide would look like, and then start to fill that in. This allows us to do things like make sure that we're covering all of the important features, make sure that things are in an order that flows nicely and is logical, and also just gives us a chance to check in with people working on Drupal CMS and say, hey, does this look like we're covering the right things? So we did a bunch of that. This outline helps inform what we've written already and what we're going to write going forward. This has actually proven to be really challenging, and maybe one of the biggest growing pains for writing the documentation for Drupal CMS is just the fact that Drupal CMS and this outline is evolving really rapidly. Prior to the release of Drupal CMS 1, features were being added and cut from the release very quickly, and it was hard for us to keep track of, not hard to keep track necessarily, but it was hard for us to figure out what should be in the outline and what was going to need to be documented when we didn't even know what the feature set was going to be. This is contrasted with the fact that we were tasked with releasing a manual for the CMS on the day that it came out. And we're at the same time being like, okay, that sounds great, but what's the CMS gonna do? And when we couldn't get answers to that, it made it hard to create an outline and write the documentation. I view this both as a challenge for the documentation, but also as a good thing. Like the promise of Drupal CMS is that it would move quickly and that features would get added in very rapidly and not this long drawn out process that we often see with Drupal core. And this is a testament to the fact that that is really happening. But it's also, I can step back now and recognize like, oh, that makes writing documentation really challenging. There's some examples of this where we would kind of talk to the Starshot track teams, and they'd be like, yeah, these are features that we're going to add to Drupal CMS. And then Amber and I would write documentation for it, and they'd be like, never mind, we're not adding that feature. And we're like, oh, well, what are we supposed to do with all this content about recurring events that we wrote but is no longer relevant? Maybe in the future, but not now. So that's been a big growing pain with that. I think that now that Drupal CMS 1.0 has been released, the dust is settling a little bit. There's a little bit clearer of a roadmap for which features will be added next, and that'll allow us to both catch up and to start to update our outline to be a more realistic example of what's in the CMS. Another growing pain that we're running into with the Drupal CMS documentation, and really Drupal as a whole, is we're needing to figure out the distinction between Drupal core and Drupal CMS. I think of this as kind of like, where does Drupal core documentation end and Drupal CMS documentation start? And is that distinction even important? From our perspective as maintainers, it's sometimes important because we're currently trying to author this Drupal CMS guide, and it's supposed to cover Drupal CMS, but not the things that Drupal core does, because that's Drupal core's documentation. And there's just some weirdness with, for example, in both Drupal CMS and Drupal core, there's a field UI that allows you to create content types and add fields to them. And they both work basically the same way. But the one in Drupal CMS is slightly different than the one that you're going to see in Drupal core, because Drupal CMS ships with a couple of contrib modules that provide additional fields, and it has a different administrative theme, so the UX is a little bit different. And we go and we start trying to document these things. If we make screenshots of one, and you're looking at the screenshot of Drupal CMS, well, the text probably matches what's in Drupal core, the screenshot might not match, or just there's a bunch of like weird overlap like that, where we're trying to figure out, like, so do we make two guides, one for Drupal core and one for Drupal CMS? And that, might be easier for people to understand, but it'd be a nightmare to maintain. Do we try to merge them together into a single guide? What does that look like? This is definitely one of the questions that we're trying to figure out right now. And yeah, I think is an important part of how we're able to move forward with, creating an outline and writing more documentation and getting it published. We need to first just figure out, how do these things overlap and how do we do it in a sustainable way? Excuse me. We so far have been doing most of the authoring in Google Docs, and this worked really well because it allowed us to get started really quickly. The infrastructure was already there. The downside of using Google Docs is it's not super accessible. It's accessible if you have the link, but if you don't have the link, it's hard to know where you can come and help collaborate. And this has made it challenging for us to engage the broader community and collaborate with everyone while writing this documentation, and that's definitely something we're working towards changing now. Our goals for this current phase of work is to move towards a more docs as code approach for Drupal CMS especially, but potentially other things as well. You could think of this as, instead of using Google Docs, writing the documentation as markdown files in a Git repository, and using the tools that our community is generally more familiar with in terms of like how we collaborate with one another. So GitLab, Drupal's issue queue, and merge requests. Once we switch to, in doing that, we want to use these tools for authoring the documentation. The goal is to still have it published on Drupal.org. So we're working towards that. Once we're able to switch to this more docs as code approach, I think this opens up some additional possibilities. The biggest one in my mind right now is that it gives us access to various GitLab CI tools. You could think of this as like allowing us to use tools to automate spell checking and style guide reviews and things like that that just help keep things more consistent. Even being able to run a script that checks all of your documentation to make sure all the links are still working would be great, and just reduce the burden on people doing maintenance so they can focus on the text itself. Think of this as kind of like PHP code sniffer, but for the text of your documentation instead of trying to lint your PHP code. We're doing some of this already with the Drupal CMS documentation. One of our current experiments is using Cypress to create screenshots for all of the things. Basically, every screenshot that is in the documentation currently is is generated by a Cypress automated test. It steps through Drupal CMS and takes screenshots of the relevant parts of the UI. Our hope here is that this makes it easier to keep these screenshots up to date going forward. For example, as the admin theme or various text on the page changes, we can just rerun these scripts and it'll update all of our screenshots basically for every new release of Drupal CMS. The other thing that we have tests for is in the documentation, anytime we reference a user interface string, so if we say like navigate to the item named content and then click on the button named add content, we verify that those strings still exist in the test. Just in case the UX changes, it'll at least point out to us, hey, you should probably update the documentation. Your step-by-step instructions are no longer accurate. It's not 100% coverage, but it definitely helps point out where things are changing. Another thing that we've been doing with Drupal CMS documentation is experimenting with different ways of funding the work that needs to happen to get the documentation done. One of those is the Adopt a Document program, where this is kind of modeled after the highway systems Adopt a Highway program, but basically it's you as a company or individual can sponsor a section of the documentation, and when you do so, that funding goes partly towards paying for the documentation to get written. Right now, that's through Drupalize Me. And so to have the documentation written and then maintained for a period of time. And part of that funding goes to the Drupal Association, who is using that to help build the infrastructure that we need for things like this docs as code approach. This is working pretty well. We've gotten a number of sponsors. I'm going to give a shout out to everybody who stepped up to sponsor pages of the documentation so far. It's definitely a new way of trying to figure out how to resource getting documentation created, and I think it has a lot of potential. If you are interested in being a sponsor, right now the best way to do that would be to contact Lenny at the Drupal Association, and she can help provide more information about what sections are available and just how the program as a whole works. Or ask me about it. Find me and ask me about it. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm going to switch topics a little bit and talk less about Drupal CMS specifically and more about Drupal.org broadly. If Drupal CMS's documentation is in its growing pains phase, I would say Drupal.org as a whole is maturing. Drupal.org has been around for a long time. There is a lot of content on Drupal.org, and part of our challenges right now is to just sort of wrangle all of that content and figure out how to make sure that all of those little edge pieces that people might run into when they first come to Drupal.org are a good reflection of the documentation. First of all, I'm hopeful that changes that we make while we're working on Drupal CMS will apply to more than just Drupal CMS, that these things like docs as code will trickle out into other parts of the ecosystem. You could imagine a scenario in the future where the documentation for a contrib module is markdown files in the repository for that contrib module that are parsed and placed into the appropriate place on Drupal.org or things like that. I think that this could be a helpful way to take the tools that we're working on now and apply them to more things in the system. I also think that there's an opportunity here to try to figure out, if we can figure out funding models for the documentation for Drupal CMS, can we also apply those more broadly to Drupal.org and Drupal core? I also think that there's some opportunities for the work that we're doing in Drupal CMS to benefit from things that have already been done on Drupal.org. One of the things I mentioned earlier was the creation of the Drupal 8 user guide and then it being subsequently updated for current versions of Drupal. That user guide already exists using a docs as code approach. It's written using ASCII doc. It lives in a Git repository on Drupal.org. Those ASCII doc files are parsed and turned into the HTML that you see when you visit these pages. And that has worked, from a maintainer perspective, that has worked really well. It has allowed us to maintain some editorial oversight or control over that documentation. It's made it easier for us to keep it up to date. It's allowed us to do things like have it all be translated, and for translation teams to be able to track what changed because there's a log in the Git repository, and that's been really great. There are some lessons we can learn from this, though. I think the biggest one is don't build your own documentation parsing system. This is primarily custom code that imports the content onto Drupal.org, and it works, but now we're in a state where it needs to be updated for the new Drupal.org, and also it kind of works. And when it doesn't work, there are like 2 people that you can ask for help to figure out why the page isn't getting updated, and that's proving problematic. The big lesson there, I think, is that we need to use existing tools for this, and also to do it in a way that's a bit more transparent. I think moving to using GitLab CI will help with that a lot versus all of this custom stuff that mostly runs on a Jenkins server that's managed by the Drupal Association. And it works, but whenever something fails, even I, as the maintainer of the documentation, can't fix it. I need to go seek out somebody else who can, and that's problematic. Another thing that I think we need to be better about and can do more of on Drupal.org, and just in our documentation in general, is be opinionated. One of my favorite examples of this that's happened recently is the sort of decision that was made to highlight DDev as the sort of, quote, official way to install and create a local development environment for Drupal. And for me, this is less about DDev. I don't care which development environment we decided to pick, whether it's DDev or Lando or Doxal or whatever. They're all really important to the community. But the fact that we were able to say, the one that we're going to recommend by default is DDev has allowed us to simplify so many things in the documentation because we were opinionated. Another way to think of this would be all the times that you tell somebody, all right, you want to get started with Drupal? They're like, yeah. And you're like, all right, first thing you need to do is install Drupal. And they go to the page and it would be like, all right, before you install Drupal, you need to set up a local development environment. And they're like, okay, I got this. And then you click on the page and it's like, here are 30 local development environments that you could choose from. All of them are just as good as any of the other, and you need to pick the one that's right for you. And you're like, ooh. How do I do that? And so now we just say, if you're not sure which one to choose, start with DDev. We still document other solutions, and you can come back to that documentation later when you realize maybe you wanted to use something different, or when the team that you're working on has chosen to use Lando instead of DDev. It's still all there. We're just opinionated. And we said, hey, if you don't know which one you want, just install this one. And now people can move right on to, like, step 2 of the process of installing Drupal should be downloading Drupal, not learning everything you need to know about the nuances of Docker and which environment you should pick. I think there's an opportunity for us to be opinionated about a lot more things when it comes to the documentation, but to do so in a way that is still inclusive of all of the projects and in different ways that Drupal can do things, just giving people a little nudge in the direction that says, hey, if you're new here and you're not sure which one, try this one first. You can learn something about how this all works and then come back and try the others later if needed. That is also some of what Drupal CMS is trying to do by more or less saying, like, hey, we recommend that you use these contributed modules to improve the SEO of your website. Or at least that they're a good starting point if you're not sure which ones to choose. Pick these, try them out. If they don't work, pick some other tools, and that's fine, it'll still work, but at least you're not having to spend a bunch of time initially just evaluating all of the tools to figure out which one to use. I think there's a big opportunity for not only to be more opinionated, but for more curation of the content that is on Drupal.org. Right now, with the community wiki that we have, anybody can add pages at any time, and that's really powerful. It means we get lots of those kind of drive-by contributors, which I really appreciate. It also means that we have a lot of pages on Drupal.org that document one person's very specific Windows 95 setup and how they were able to accomplish this thing at this time, and it's and now it's there and it's written, and because it's a wiki, like it just kind of stays there forever. And if that's the first page that somebody lands on when they're trying to figure out how to install Drupal, it's just not creating a good first impression. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to sort of figure out more ways to kind of tame that sprawl. In addition to that, on the one hand, you have these nodes that are, 2,000 words long that explain some situation that is relevant to like 3 people. You also have the scenario where it's like you go to the documentation to figure out how to add fields to a content type, and it's missing like half the steps. Because someone documented a few things in a lot of depth, but they forgot like the first 2 steps. And so I think part of curation is also being able to go and identify where there are gaps in the documentation. And even if you're not the one or we're not the ones that write it, just being able to say, hey, there are missing steps here that should be documented. In addition to that, we can take things like the style guide and voice and tone that we've created for Drupal CMS guideline, or for the Drupal CMS guide, and apply that more broadly to content on Drupal.org, with the goal of just creating a documentation that's more consistent. So again, the goal isn't for it to all just be like boring and mundane, but it is nice as a reader of the documentation for it to be of a consistent quality, to have a consistent voice. I think it helps build trust in the documentation when that is true. There are some infrastructure updates that we need to make to Drupal.org. I think this is part of the system maturing too. I don't know, this is api.drupal.org, which parses the code looking for documentation strings and then publishes them on api.drupal.org. And it's in some ways improved over the years, but in some ways has deteriorated too, and I think we need to work on addressing those. This example shows on the left the form API documentation for Drupal 7, and then Drupal 9, and then Drupal 11. And you can see on the left there's a bunch of comprehensive documentation about all of the different properties and ways that you can use the form API, and over time we've slowly lost all of that, and now we basically just have a page with like 2 sentences of text, a couple of links, and it no longer even lists the elements that you can add to a form. And this is just, as Drupal core has changed, the parser that is used to generate these pages hasn't kept up with those changes, and so things just are starting to go missing, and that makes the documentation look bad because it's missing things. I think there are some opportunities to try to figure out what is the role of artificial intelligence with regards to documentation. I have a few thoughts about this. One of them is that, whether people are using AI to learn how to do things in Drupal. Just true statement. They're searching, how do I, they go to our documentation, they can't figure out how to add a field to a content type, so they ask ChatGPT, how do I add a field to a content type, and it gives them some instructions. And most of the time, those instructions are good enough to help them accomplish whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. I think we need to make sure that our documentation is accurate so that when the AI overlords read the documentation, they are given accurate information and presenting that to people. I also think there's some opportunities for using AI to help author documentation. This might be things like helping with review for voice and tone. You could imagine when documentation runs through GitLab CI, there could be a script that says, hey, also have ChatGPT review this to make sure that it matches our style guide, and to comment back into the merge request. It looks like you used e-mail instead of email, and Drupal's documentation standards say it should be this one. So I think there's some opportunities there. Also with the sort of like taming the sprawl, I could imagine a scenario like feed a outline of all of Drupal's documentation into one of these LLMs and ask it like, what's missing? And use that as a starting point to start to fill in some of those gaps. So that all sounds great, right? All we need to do is write a better manual, but actually we need to write all the manuals better, because it turns out that people don't go to just the one good one that we put in front of them, and instead they go to all of them. So we need to apply these tools and ideas out across all of the documentation. How do we get this all done? Like I said before, I think this is a really big undertaking, or a big hill to climb. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's going to be a lot of work, and I think it requires some changes in how we think about how the documentation for Drupal is authored and by who. One of the things that I've discovered by looking into the documentation for a lot of our competition when researching this for Drupal CMS is that all of these projects, probably all of these projects that we look to and say, wow, they have really great documentation, we would like to mimic that. For all of these projects, the documentation is written by a combination of staff and volunteers. All of these projects have a person, usually a team of persons, whose full-time job includes contributing to and maintaining this documentation. And that's just not something that we have in the Drupal community right now. We have a lot of, like I said at the beginning, we have a lot of people who volunteer their time and do a lot of really great work. But it's also time that is volunteered. Or we have people like myself whose companies allow them to work on the documentation when time permits, right? Like if I have deadlines at work that I need to accomplish, and there are also things going on in the community, I have to focus on the things that are paying the company that I work for first, and the things that are good for the community second. And we do the best we can, but that doesn't always pan out in the way that we hope it would. Or really what it means is someone might come along with a question, but I'm busy over here doing work stuff, and I can't get back to them and answer that for weeks sometimes. So I think one of the things we need to try to figure out is, how do we change this? How do we make it so that there are people in the Drupal community whose job is maintenance and improvement of our documentation? I think progress requires us figuring this out. And that it's a problem that is like, it's at the scale of the community. This isn't a problem that any one company or one individual can resolve. It's something that we as a community need to come together and figure out, how do we make this happen? Especially in the ecosystem of Drupal, where there isn't one, most of these other competitors have a corporate sponsor, who is employing people to work on their documentation. That's just not the way that things work in our community. We've been experimenting with this a little bit with things like the Adopt a Doc program, and I think that helps, but I think there's also more that needs to be figured out. I don't know the answer to this question. I just recognize that, I think what we need to do is have people who are working on this stuff full time. Like I said, Adopt a Document is one of the things that we're doing to help with that. I would say this initiative, with regards to Drupal CMS, has been really productive. It's helped to make sure that those of us who are part of the program have time dedicated to working on the documentation and all of the policies and guides that would need to be in place for that documentation to be written. I don't think that a program like this scales to all of Drupal.org. So I think that is kind of one of my major recommendations is, as a community, we need to figure out how to make it possible for people to work on documentation full time. Some other recommendations I have: there is a documentation working group. I am a part of this documentation working group. It was created probably about 10 years ago, around the time that we first authored the user guide. The charter of the working group is to define governance for Drupal's documentation. We did a lot of work initially to do that. The group has the group has totally atrophied over the past 10 years. Currently, I'm the only person who is part of the documentation working group who is also still doing Drupal. And so I think there's a need for us to revive this group and maybe to change some of what the group's responsibilities are. Right now, its responsibilities are to define kind of like the governance model for the documentation, but I could also see a case where the group is, being more of a entity that celebrates the successes and the people in the community, like a community building entity for Drupal's documentation. I put this slide up here a little bit as like a way to keep myself accountable, and now you all can too, because I'm going to say that this is a thing that I would like to take on. I would like to figure out how to revive this group and what to do with that energy next. I mentioned this already, but I think there's a need for Drupal to have a documentation lead. And really, I think there is a need for that documentation lead to be someone who is paid to be the documentation lead, not just someone who can volunteer a couple hours a week in that role. Once we figure out how to do that, I think that the role of the documentation lead primarily is to reduce the barriers for volunteers contributing to Drupal's documentation. To me, you could think of this as kind of like doing the grunt work that nobody else wants to do. There's so much work in the documentation that in order to improve it, for example, someone needs to go through and like figure out which pages are still relevant and which ones aren't, and work on cleaning them up or deleting them or that kind of stuff. And that's really hard right now because there's very few people that even have the authority to delete pages on Drupal.org, and those people aren't focused on the documentation. They're doing other things. I think that a documentation lead could play a role of setting and overseeing a strategy for the documentation, helping build momentum within the community. Another thing that they could do is just providing easy on-ramps for people who want to contribute. I've had a number of people come to me in the past and be like, hey, I'm interested in contributing to Drupal documentation. Where should I start? And you're like, I don't know, go to the documentation issue queue and pick something. And they go there, and it's overwhelming because there's like a few hundred issues in the queue, and you can read all of them, and then you're still not sure where you should start. And this is back to that kind of being opinionated. A documentation lead could play the role of saying, oh, well, in the community, our priorities right now are these 3 things. Do any of those match up with your interest and skill set? And if they do, this would be a great place to start. And if not, I've got a whole other list of priorities that we could look at. So that's a role that I would love to see someone filling in the future. So in conclusion, as any good documentation template will remind you, you always need to end with a conclusion and some tangible next steps. We talked a little bit about my thesis that there is a perception problem with Drupal's documentation, and one of the goals needs to be to change that perception so that people have a good first impression, regardless of how they end up on Drupal's documentation. I talked quite a bit about the ongoing work with Drupal CMS Guide and the Adopt a Document program, the progress that we're making there, and things that we're hoping will trickle out to the rest of the documentation ecosystem and help improve the tools and policies that we use for writing the documentation. I talked a little bit about the Drupal.org infrastructure, and excuse me, and then made some suggestions like that we need to figure out how to revive the documentation working group, and that it would be awesome to have someone fulfilling a role as documentation lead for our community, all with the goal of changing people's perception and making the documentation more awesome. If you want to get involved, if you want to help with this, some good places to get started would be the Drupal Starshot documentation track. There's a meta issue, it's linked here. There's not currently a lot of information on that, but I would say if you're interested in the Starshot documentation, that would be a good place to even just go and comment and say, hey, I'm interested in helping out, and we'll figure out how to help you get involved. You can ping me on Slack in the documentation channel. I'm EOJ the Brave. You can send me an email if you want to, and I will help point you to some of the right places. If you are in a position to do so, or your company is, and you're interested in sponsoring the Adopt a Document program, you can contact Lenny at the Drupal Association for more information about that. And that's what I have to say about the documentation. Thank you for taking some time to think about this with me and to hopefully move things forward in a positive way. That's all I have to say about it. We've got a little bit of time left, and if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, track me down in the hall or at the contribution sprints on Thursday. I'll be around, and I'm happy to hear other people's ideas about how to deal with any of this. welcome. I assume that we'll be able to have these slides published on the DrupalCon website so that you can also find these links there, but yeah. Really just remember, find me on Slack and then I can point you to all these links again. I'm happy to do so. Yeah.
I don't know if I can make this into a question. We'll see.
Okay.
But one of the issue queue can be hard to navigate for people who are especially who are new, but also kind of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. Do you think that it's possible that the documentation could be separated from? I don't know. Should be separated. But that seems like a barrier, like a real barrier. If somebody, when I go to like GitHub documentation or something like, I guess I do end. It does prompt me to create an issue.
Mm-hmm.
If I edit, but I can kind of just edit or suggest an edit. It becomes a pull request, and that's kind of what that is.
Yeah. So the question is kind of about like if Drupal's issue queue can be overwhelming, especially for people who are new and trying to figure out where to get started. How do we make sure that that's not a barrier for people who want to contribute to documentation? And I totally agree with you. The issue queue can be very overwhelming, especially if that is the place that you are going to get started. I think that part of this is for people who are interested in who are interested in making an edit or suggesting edits to a page, we need to have easier on-ramps for them. The two that I think of are sort of the GitHub equivalent, which is like you click edit and it opens up that markdown file in the built-in GitHub editor, and you can make some changes and then hit a button and it creates a pull request. For the documentation, like for Drupal CMS, that's my hope, is that it's the equivalent of that. You're reading it on the page, you're like, ooh, there's a typo. You hit edit, you create a merge request. That's different than what we have right now, where you click edit on a node and you make a change and you save it, and that change is published immediately. There are some benefits to that. The downside is those changes don't go through any kind of review process. And I think that's part of how we keep things consistent, is making sure that there's peer review for all of the changes, even the simple ones like fixing a typo. Another thing that I think would be great would be some kind of like feedback widget at the bottom of the documentation pages, like a basic like thumbs up, thumbs down, or like, and then like if they thumbs down, then like, what do you want to know more about? And as the end user, you maybe fill out that widget and hit submit, and maybe in the background it creates an issue in the issue queue, but you never had to go to the issue queue and fill out that really complicated form with like 10 different select lists to create an issue. And then I think this is part of the role that having a documentation lead does too, is for people who are interested in contributing more than just edits to a specific page, the documentation lead will have read the whole issue queue and had been keeping up with kind of what's going on, and they'll be able to more quickly point you to the places where people are working right now or where current priorities are. One of the challenges right now is we send people to the issue queue and say, yeah, just work on anything. And it's kind of like, well, I don't know, part of the fun of this is like, I want to work on things that are impactful and I want to do it with other people. And I don't want to work on an issue and spend an afternoon on it and realize like, no one actually cares about this right now, and my question is going to sit here unanswered for 6 months. So, yeah. Does that answer your?
No, totally.
Cool.
It really seems like a documentation lead is pretty critical for basically all the parts of this. If you want to be able to invest,
I think so. Yeah.
It's unrealistic.
Yeah.
Otherwise.
And it's not unprecedented. We've had documentation leads in the past for Drupal. People who've primarily worked as volunteers and then burned out doing so, and it's just going to be a bigger and bigger challenge too, as Drupal and its feature set has grown. The amount of documentation has also grown. You could think of like, there are lots of people who work on Drupal core maintainers whose roles are essentially to play that lead for either their particular silo of Drupal core or for Drupal core as a whole. But you think all the time we have these community initiatives that focus people's efforts on the things that we've decided, like this is where we're going to work on Drupal core right now. And again, with the documentation, it's just like, I don't know, just go work on making things better.
documentation is like a module's README.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I've had technical writers come to me and say, well, okay, I want to contribute as a technical writer to Drupal's documentation. Where can I start? And I wonder if there's a way for us to somehow be able to point technical writers to core or contributed module maintainers who are rapidly or who need help with their READMEs, because and I wonder if there's a way to kind of help empower people to do that, and create a pathway, or some kind of, or even make authors aware of, like, you know what, there's like people who want to help you with your README.
Yeah, so the question is, like, if someone comes to you, or if you are a technical writer who's interested in getting started contributing to Drupal, how do we connect you with the contrib module authors who might need help with their documentation, or just places that your input can be effective? And I think this, partially it goes back to the earlier question of, like, how do we help people who are new navigate the issue queue? And I think a lot of that just comes down, it's like a human power thing. I don't know that there's much we can do in terms of just like making the issue queue easier, or, we've done this in the past too, where we'll like create a page on Drupal.org that lists the current priorities for documentation projects on Drupal.org. But like, you have to find that page first before you even know that that's a place to start. And there's just so many, there are lots of, pages listing priorities and templates and policies and guidelines that have been authored. It's just like, even just getting people to those in the first place, I think partially comes from the people that they asked when they started, knowing that they exist and being able to point them to it. It's kind of like, we have contribution mentoring, and I think a big part of the contrib mentoring workshops is reducing that hurdle for people who are interested in contributing to the code, right? It's like teaching them how to use the issue queue, where to find things to work on, who to connect with, all of that. And we just don't have that same level of onboarding for people who are interested in contributing to documentation.
I think about the needs for review queue initiative, and there's someone in there who like does a lot of work in Slack to like, hey, this issue needs review, and is like pinging maintainers. And I wonder if we can mobilize people in Slack to help, look at the contribution channel, and just kind of communicate and say, hey, you know what, if you need help with your README, head over to the documentation and try and kind of grease the wheels of communication and connecting people to documentarians.
Yeah, I mean, I think even like we see that happen too with some initiatives. You see it a lot with various like Drupal CMS initiatives or other community initiatives, where there is a well-organized Slack channel and they have regular meetings in Slack where people can come and say like, hey, I'm interested in contributing, where should I get started? There's certainly no reason we couldn't do that in the documentation channel, but that requires someone who has the capacity to do that. And right now, we just don't have anyone operating in that space. You could, or anyone could, right? It's not because we don't allow it. Right. It's more just like, it's a hard thing to do, and it requires a lot of time. And again, a lot of those initiatives are led by, have a project manager, have a lead for the initiative, who has dedicated time to run those Slack meetings and help keep things organized. So, but we could also start trying to figure out, maybe the sort of volunteer version of that is a once a month Slack meeting instead of once a week. Like, you could start smaller, and I don't know. I'll have to ponder that more. I'm always conscious of like, that's a good idea. I hope somebody else does that. It's our time's up, so I just want to make sure that I'm happy to keep answering questions, but it's 8:50, and so if you are ready to scuttle off to the coffee break, you should feel free to do so. And again, if you want to talk about this stuff more, just track me down, and I'm happy to either answer questions and would love any suggestions that people have about how we can deal with some of these things. So thanks for coming.